And so we are in a series called Looking Back, where we're reviewing our history, and we started last week with our early years. And I made a comment, a historical comment, that someone believed was false, and in part it was. And in part it wasn't. And so I want to share with you that according to the United States of America, the bill annexing Texas as a state was signed December 29th of 1845. I had said last week that Texas became a state in 1846. Now, if you're on the Texas side of things, Texas did not relinquish their sovereignty until February 19th of 1846. So it really depends on which side of all of this you're in. I will be doing some more history today, and all errors are mine. We'll leave it at that. We'll just leave it at that. Will you pray with me? O holy and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation on all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you, O God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to start by looking at this passage that we just heard from 1 King, this story about Solomon building the temple. Even these early Israelites who had settled in the promised land were looking and longed for a place where they could gather together, where they could celebrate God's presence. They had been in the wilderness, perhaps not this same generation, obviously, but they knew the story. While they were in the wilderness, they knew that God followed them as a pillar of cloud by day, as a pillar of fire by night. They had the Ark of the Covenant that they carried with them to remind them of God's presence. And so they had all of these things. They simply had no place to call the Lord's house. And it was during the reign of Solomon's father, King David, when David really wanted to build a temple, but the Lord would not allow it. David's reign was also a time of turbulence and war and violence, and the Lord would not permit him to build the house. And so after King David died and his son Solomon was sitting on the throne, one of the first things that Solomon did was he prayed for wisdom. He prayed for discernment. And God was so pleased that he prayed for that and not for riches that he gave him both. So he got wisdom and riches. But because of the wisdom, this godly insight that Solomon had been given, the people enjoyed peace. And this is the people across Israel, across Judah. Kings would come to counsel with him, to learn from him. And so it was a time of great peace. And so it is in that time of peace that Solomon prepares to build the temple. Now, one of his dad's good friends, King Hiram of Tyre, sent messengers after Solomon had been placed on the throne. And so in a back and forth, this was a little bit before text messaging, in a back and forth between the kingdoms, they agreed that King Hiram's workers would provide all of the timber, the cedars and the cypress, and prepare all of that. Meanwhile, Solomon rounded up some 80,000 stone cutters to carve out, to go to the quarry and carve out the big stones for the foundation of this temple that was described for you earlier. It took them 7 years to complete the temple. And if you continue in 2 Kings, if you're curious and you want to pull out your Bible, 2 Kings is kind of early in the Bible. Look at the table of contents. You'll see that he goes on to talk about the furnishings, and he goes on to talk about all of the symbols that went into that temple. And so I think it's fascinating for us to consider the building of that very first temple, that very first house of the Lord, alongside what our ancestors went through in order for us to have this space. It's a pretty phenomenal story. I cannot tell you, even yesterday I was up here for a memorial service, and even then, every time somebody new walks into the sanctuary, they talk about how beautiful it is. And I can always say thank you because I wasn't here in 1893. It's not anything I did, right? But it is. You and I agree. There is just something about this space. I don't know how you would describe it. There are times when it simply just feels holy and sacred. And so it is such a gift to us that we do have this space. There's history, there's rich symbolism that's embedded in the windows and in the wood. It's embedded in the altarpieces, and it's in the entire design of this space. This was not an accidental building. So I want to go back and pick up our story. I had shared with you last week that a gentleman named Dr. Francis Asbury Mood had been named to lead the new university. You remember Georgetown College had agreed that they would allow the Methodist college to come into town. It was first called Texas University, and then the state decided they wanted that name about a year and a half later. So it was Southwestern University. And he came to town excited because there were 353 members on the roll, but when he got here, he was so discouraged. He could only find 14 who were active. And in our history books, it says the 14 active Methodists Dr. Mood found in Georgetown late in the summer of 1873 were loosely organized and met infrequently. And a Union Sunday school was rather thinly attended. There was a flourishing temperance society called the Band of Hope, which was the most popular moral or religious organization at this time. And along with all other towns in Texas, Georgetown needed some temperance influence since saloons were running wide open day and night. There were no church buildings in town. And as I'd shared, the denominations were Methodist, Presbyterian, who were in the process of building a church, Cumberland Presbyterian, and Baptist. And they'd been sharing or alternating service in the courthouse of Price's Hall, which was the second floor of the Lockett Building at 7th and Austin Avenue. So the Presbyterian Church nears completion in 1874, and their officers begin to propose dividing up the Sunday so the other denominations can worship there. They made an offer to the Methodists that they could meet once a month for $30 a year. Who wants rent like that, right? Wouldn't that be great? But Dr. Mood called together the members of the Methodist Church. They met on January 11th of 1874 to consider this proposition, and 37 of those present enrolled their names, and a petition was forwarded to the trustees of Southwestern asking if they could instead hold services in their chapel. The church commenced, and it was approved. The church commenced weekly prayer meetings every Thursday and organized a Sunday school to meet in the afternoon so they didn't interfere with the Union Sunday school classes. There were 30 scholars enrolled in the Methodist Sunday School. Now, at this time, in 1874, the Georgetown circuit still consisted of 12 churches. And they were all served by one minister. If you're interested, I love that the Common English Bible changed the language so we weren't talking in cubits, but we were talking in feet this morning as we talked about Solomon's Temple. The two-story building at Southwestern that we met in measured 60 by 75 feet. It had 6 classrooms and a chapel auditorium, which seated about 400. I want you to think about that. This is really early in the days of Georgetown, and already they had a space that would seat such a large crowd. Professor S.G. Sanders of the faculty wrote that he felt like he was entering a cave as he went in the front door of the building, so rough was the appearance of the unplastered rock walls. Now, those walls are rock, but we have plastered over them, so just as you're trying to imagine what this might have looked like. It wasn't this building, but obviously it was made of stone, as ours is. Went on to describe how the damp conditions were really difficult for Dr. Mood, and he suffered from lots of bronchial ailments. They lived on the first floor of the building, and so during church services, people went upstairs to the chapel, and then mamas, as the babies started to get a little fussy, would go back downstairs to Mrs. Mood's bedroom and put their children down there. That was the first nursery. Small birds nested in the inside crevices of the rock walls and sang during worship. And as the Sunday school classes grew, they convened in classrooms and even went down to the Moods apartment to meet. But this growth brought about a lot of changes. The circuit was reduced from 12 to 2 in 1876, so Georgetown and Round Rock shared a pastor. And this created a need for a parsonage, which was furnished to Reverend George Graves, and it was located in the 800 block of Walnut Street. I didn't drive by and get a picture, but I think it'd be interesting to go see what stands there. I can't picture it in my head right now. There were lots of changes going on at the university. I'm trying to set the stage for how we get here. There were lots of changes going on at the university. We are still in the 1870s. And what was really interesting was that ladies were requesting admittance to the university, and they kept getting turned down. But there was a rumor floating around town that another denomination planned to open a school for ladies, and pretty soon Southwestern University changed their mind and rented the basement of the new Presbyterian church, and classes for women started September 9th, 1878. Isn't that fabulous? And by the next year, they had completed a sightly frame 2-story building with well-furnished dormitory and classrooms to house the young ladies. It was located in the 1100 block of Main Street, which our notes say was later the site of Annie Pearl Public School. I think that's now the site of Dos Sauces. Is that right? It's about right, isn't it? 1100 block? Thank you, Stephen. And although the same faculty served both the male and female students, all of the classes were separate, and different catalogs were issued for the two different schools. The rail system came to town in 1878. There was a tap line that was completed between Georgetown and Round Rock. It's brought up in catalogs with the university, and the newspaper also indicated that people would ride the tap line from Round Rock to Georgetown to attend Methodist services at the campus chapel. There's a great story that there were two pastors who were trying to arrive at a specific time, and the engine ran short of water in Round Rock, and they had to wait until it could get more water, and they waited and waited. They finally despaired and chartered a hack to drive them, but they were overtaken by the train on their way to Georgetown. There were lots of advances for both Georgetown and the Methodist Church during the 70s. It was an important time in our history. We became a full station, meaning we had a pastor simply assigned to us in 1879. James Campbell was that first pastor, and he was one of 4 men in the very first graduating class of Southwestern University. So if you're not sure there's a connection between us and Southwestern, I hope that you're beginning to catch on that we're just tied at the hip, at least in our early years. The congregation started discussing its own church, and on April 12, 1881, it purchased 1/2 of the 1,000 block facing East Church Street. And we're not on East Church Street, are we? They had engaged an architect to draw up plans, and bids were solicited for construction of the church. But then within a few months, they changed their minds. So it is okay for us to get excited about something that we're going to do and then rethink it. It's part of our history as well. Instead, they put a parsonage up on that site. According to Mrs. McKinnon, who wrote that 1881 was in the dreadful Reconstruction period when money was hard to get. Church membership had dropped to 185. And so the congregation decided to build a low 1-story flat roof structure, partially below ground level, to which they could later add an upper story. It would face University Avenue and was just northeast of this location on the southwest corner of Southwestern's campus. It would cost about $5,000. Oh, wow. Ground was broken for the chapel on April 3rd, 1882. Once it was built, everybody was delighted to have a place. It was not anything to look at. We do have a few pictures from that time. I'm going to get Tiffany to put some of those up on our website and share them in our e-news. But it was just a little short, squatty building, and it really didn't have much at all to write home about. If you wanted a place to sit, you had to bring your own. The windows, I think the ladies cut out paper to put over them. But there were a number of men who are listed as being members of this church and worshiping in this church who later went on to become Methodist pastors. And so something was still happening, something powerful and spirit-led was happening even in that squatty chapel building. When the Northwest Conference met in the fall of 1882, the little church reported an increase in membership after that 1881 slump. Delegates at the conference, the Northwest Conference, heard church officials stress the urgent need for practicing temperance in the use of alcohol and tobacco. So kind of get your mind going on what's going on in town. So maybe not everybody in town was going to church and going home on Saturday night early to go to bed, get ready for church. They hired an architect to start working on the second floor of that chapel with the intention of doing that through about 1890. And again, Mrs. McKinnon offers this narrative. She says, Mr. J.T. Sneed and Mr. M.B. Lockett, members of the building committee, had a vision of the future and insisted that new ground be purchased and an entirely new building be planned and erected. This handsome church, present sanctuary, has been pronounced by out-of-state visitors as one of the most distinctive church buildings in Texas. It has been remarked on more than one occasion that it really has the atmosphere and appearance of a church and not a theater, as so many modern church buildings have. Its beautiful stained glass windows and the spire reaching up towards the heavens, the cool, restful interior, its dignified lines, its ivy-covered walls, which are not ivy-covered anymore, are all conducive to the spirit of worship as one enters. And so they purchased this space. They paid $1,200 for this half block of land that this building stands on. They bought it from Sue Mood, the widow of Francis Mood. Construction began soon after and would cost approximately $25,000, including the stained glass windows and some of the furnishings. Right? I know. There was much excitement as they prepared to lay the cornerstone on March 9th of 1892. There was a circuit rider who had come through to preach on a Sunday night, and it was an excellent sermon. And then Bishop Joseph S. Key was here on the train. He remained all week. He was going to preach on Sunday morning. He was going to do some lectures and addresses and all of this, and then he was there to preside over the laying of the cornerstone. The land on which this church stands was patented by the Republic of Texas, and the document was signed by President Sam Houston in 1844. It was then granted to colonists who would then sell off bits and pieces to different folks, and eventually was sold to the Moods, who sold it to us. Let's talk a little bit about the building itself. The Gothic Revival theme of the sanctuary's architecture is established by a prominent corner bell tower and spire reaching 4 1/2 stories. I'm not sure it's still 4 1/2 stories. You'll recall there was that one period where we had to redo the steeple, and we weren't sure if we were going to redo it or cap it. If you're not familiar with that story, send me an email. I'll send you the story. It's great. Pointed arches and lens-set windows of leaded stained glass accent the style. Native limestone covers the exterior with dressed cut stonework in a rough-faced ashlar. I have no idea what that means. The cruciform floor plan takes its shape from that of a Greek cross, with its equidistant upright members and arms providing a space for the altar and the choir on the west and seating in the other three sections. And of course, the balcony, which hangs in the east end of the nave. The builder was, the construction crew was from Belford Lumber Company. If you know anything about your history here in Georgetown and some of the historic homes, many of them were built by Belford Lumber Company. Waterston Brothers Stonecutters of Austin did the stonework for us. It was hauled by a mule team from quarries west of Georgetown and hand cut and dressed by the Waterstons. The overall design is credited to Dr. Robert Stewart Heyer, professor of natural science at Southwestern University and a member of the church's building committee. He built a 3-foot scale model of the proposed structure of wood and tin to show his ideas to the building committee and the work crew. Construction spanned 1891 and 92, with completion of the interior and installation of fixtures and furnishings in 1893. Dr. Heyer was something of a creative genius. He loved woods and woodworking. He carved the pulpit and the communion table for the church and was reimbursed by the church for his expenses to Austin and San Antonio, where he purchased other furnishings. A stylized ichthus, or fish, an important symbol in our faith, decorates the top of the tall church spire. If you haven't seen the fish at the top of the steeple, I encourage you on your way out to look up. It's pretty cool. They go on to give a lot of information about the windows and the art that is behind them. If you haven't taken a moment to really study the windows, I hope you will. This window up at the top actually did not have a menorah in it initially. It was broken during a repair. The window before that had depicted a cross upon a rock. But you look around at all of the symbols and all that went in. You see the pastel colors. It's not overly bright at all, but there is a lot of symbolism, not only in those windows, but throughout our sanctuary. The formal dedication of the sanctuary, though it was completed in 1893, was postponed until all indebtedness of its costs had been retired. It took place on the third Sunday of October in 1896. That's pretty fabulous. So it's a marvelous story of a community that worked together to build something that, frankly, has lasted, has been cared for through generations, has come to us to be cared for, not only for those who gather this day, but for the generations that will come after us. And much of the story that I've shared with you, though, really focuses in on the building of this space. It gives a lot of details about who did what and when. But you and I both know that there is more to the story than the people. And so I want us to go back for just a minute to the story from 1 Kings. In that story, there is one section where God speaks to Solomon. And he says to him, "Regarding this temple you are building, if you follow my laws and act my regulations and keep all my commands faithfully, then I will fulfill for you my promise that I made to your father David. I will live among the Israelites. I won't abandon my people." He never said one thing about the design of the temple, never said one thing about how it was to be cared for and kept. God's concern was for the people that would gather there. I believe that is true for us. Changes have been made to this space, but God still looks to us to continue the work that God has given in this great community called Georgetown. We are many years away from what our ancestors did during the time of King Solomon. We are many years away from when this church was built and occupied. And for many years to come, you and I will continue to have work to do in this community. Thanks be to God. Amen.